the presenters. All right,
Hey,
everybody
Ian, we
hear
can
me?
see your presenter slides.
Loud and clear, good. See the mushroom? Okay, very quickly. So I'm going to talk about authorised prescriber scheme, psychedelics and HRECs. And so I'll just go through this. So from July 1 this year, psilocybin and MDA can be prescribed by specially authorised psychiatrists. This was following lobbying by various groups and patient groups, as we can tie in before with consumers, lobbying from consumers and various lobbying groups about changing the scheduling of these drugs. So these two drugs are now Schedule 8, and they were in Schedule 9, which means imports were prohibited and were only accessible by clinical trial. So I'm just going to show my screen. Sorry, I've just got to display. There we go. So these two drugs are now in Schedule 8. So the approval was for only two disease states, which was post-traumatic stress, we call it disorder, or PTSD, and MDMA was approved for that, and psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, or TRD. So there's a few acronyms there. Psychiatrists will need to be approved under the authorised prescriber scheme, or we call it AP, by the TGA. So they still need to be approved. So this is a bit of a funny one, and I'll go through that in a minute. So the scheme allows basically the authorised prescriber, psychiatrists, to prescribe these drugs in a batch of patients, so individual approval is not needed. So there's a caveat to this. Approval from a HREC is required. So this is a bit of a weird one. The TGA is having its cake and eating it too. They're saying, look, we don't want to be approving this by ourselves. We'd rather a HREC do it. And they're having their cake and eating it too, because they're saying, well, actually, we don't want to be responsible 100%. We'd like a HREC to share our responsibility, particularly if anything goes wrong. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So there aren't any approved drug products yet. So these drugs are unapproved, and for unapproved, you will read expensive. So this is one of the problems I'll outline in a minute, that these drugs, I think Canada is sourced in Canada, but they are going to be quite expensive. So it says the guidelines the TGA have published that psilocybin and MDA must be used in a medically controlled setting.
It's just taking money off.
So I think if someone could mute, that would be good. Psilocybin and MDA must be used in a medically controlled setting. So my question is, what is that? TGA recognises that patients may be vulnerable during the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy called PAT, P-A-T, and hence the control. So that's the DER statement, that these patients are vulnerable during this therapy. So nothing is defined, unfortunately. So as I said, no one's defined what medically controlled setting is and what vulnerable is. So as we stand, there are already some applications, authorised prescriber applications submitted to the TGA. So some HRECs have approved them, or HREC chairs, if they have the delegation. So the big question is, what does the HREC need to do for PAT approval, given that the PAT, as we saw, is standard for psychedelic-assisted therapy? So it says that the HREC must evaluate a psychiatrist's submission and approve or endorse it. HREC must monitor the psychiatrist's use of these unapproved goods to assure that continued approval is warranted. And the HREC needs to collect reports of things such as adverse events during the prescribing process. So this is a bit weird, this method of approval of these drugs by the TGA, because our authorised prescriber, we have traditionally relied on a lot of assumptions. So one of the assumptions, and we do here in Adelaide, or I do authorised prescriber for things like prothesis from orthopaedic surgeons. So historically, obviously, I can rely on the fact that the orthopaedic surgeon is qualified in surgery and qualified in orthopaedic surgery, and that the action or the operation will take place in a proper facility, and with qualified people doing it. So that's been an assumption, a DER assumption, which I obviously can rely on for authorised prescriber approval. So, however, some of these the psychedelics are going to be taken on faith, really, and so we have to look at clinical governance. So it's a bit of a strange one. The evaluate, monitor, and collect for this PAT, as we've seen, is difficult, and I think that's going to be difficult, because the evidence, why is that? The evidence base for the PAT therapy is limited and emerging. And I was going to put limited and emerging in italics because some psychiatrists have argued that the evidence is non-existent or very, very limited and shouldn't be relied on, and the TGA has made a very rash decision. However, there are two parts for this. The psychedelic assisted therapy, or PAT. There's the drug and the psychological component. So this again is weird because normally authorized prescriber, you're looking at a thing like a drug, a single drug, or a prothesis or something like that. So this is, again, a bit strange. There are two parts, the drug and the psychological component. The drugs, of course, are what they are. The psychological component is what nobody seems to know what that is or what that will be, whether it's the same as what's used overseas. So it's a bit unusual. So the question you have to ask yourself is, do the psychiatrists using this psychedelic assisted therapy have the appropriate training and experience? And as I said, we can't assume they have, unlike any other authorised prescriber applications. Have they used these drugs in a clinical trial? Because that's important. And is the therapy being delivered under highly controlled conditions? And I said, what are they? Traditionally, authorised prescriber is done inside a hospital, as I said, or inside a theatre for a prothesis. So what is a highly controlled condition? What does that mean? And so the big critical question is, how are the potential patients for this therapy being selected? What if you select the wrong patient? What happens then? And hence my next point is, what if it goes bad? So there have been cases overseas where this therapy has gone bad. And so therefore, should you insist as a HREC or a HREC chair on informed consent, or should you even put a black box warning on the consent? How do you ensure that consent is informed? You're not there at the consent process. You need to put a black box warning on it. Black box warning on it. So, in my view, the authorised prescriber protocol should be as rigorous as that submitted for a clinical trial. You're going to have to know all this stuff. And also, I'm a great believer in independent reviews. So I think the HREC should obtain independent psychiatric review of the submitted AP protocol. And the HREC may also wish to check governance before the authorised prescriber approval. So things like who's paying for these expensive drugs. The protocol, some of the protocols have used psychiatrists all day, like they're there all day. And I've talked to psychiatrists in Adelaide who said no psychiatrist will spend all day with these patients. So the question would be, are they going to use psychologists? Is that acceptable? And who is paying for this extensive time within the counselling session that accompanies these drugs? So again, weirdly, authorised prescriber, you've never ever checked governance. Maybe you need to look into the governance before the authorised prescriber approval. So in a nutshell, a very good, and I'll hold this up to the microphone, a very good piece of governance is the therapeutic use of psychedelics. Very good guidance produced by the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, who ask a lot of these hard questions. So I think again, this is possibly a good advance in therapy, but again, be careful if you're a HREC chair or a HREC where you have to where you're in a position to approve authorised prescriber. I think you need to be very careful and almost treat it like a clinical trial as for the standard of the protocol. So that's all I had. Thanks very much.
That's fantastic and very interesting. Are you aware if there's any other example of this in Australia or indeed the experience overseas?
Yes, well, as I said, there have been a couple of applications that have been approved by a HREC or a HREC chair that have gone to the TGA for approval. And I don't know what happens if the TGA said, no, that's rubbish, and send it back where you'd be, or are they just a rubber stamp to say, yep, we're happy. So I think they're having their cake and eating it too. Overseas, there have been for 10, 15 years, these drugs have been used in clinical trial settings, or indeed some pseudo therapy sessions. And that's what I said. There have been cases where they go bad. And in the opinion of a lot of psychiatrists, it's because the patients weren't selected properly. There have been occasions where there's been suicide ideation or that after the therapy. And the other big question is that these drugs have never had any large phase 3 trials. So we don't know how long the effect lasts, what other effects there could be long term. So some psychiatrists are very skeptical of this therapy. Others are saying, yep, let's give it a go, because for treatment-resistant depression and some post-traumatic stress patients, they've failed every other therapy. So as is traditional in human research. They've failed everything else. Let's give something else a go. So, but I'm just putting it out there and saying, look, there's a caveat here. If you are approving authorised prescriber, I think it can be, you need to be very rigorous, unlike previous authorised prescriber applications, which are straightforward.
There is a comment in the chat from Rob Lobley, just commenting that it's their understanding that HREC is endorsing the APE and not approval. Is that your understanding? It's an endorsing?
No, it is. The words are endorsing. If I can look at my slide.
Yeah.
Where was it? Hang on, sorry.
That's okay. So again, I think the nomenclature is coming through as a theme today, isn't it? It's to get the right term and everyone is using the same.
Yeah.
And have done
approval from a HREC is required, and that's in the guidance. So what does that mean really? And as I said, it's for a prosthesis, it's easy. You can assume lots of stuff. You know, the surgeon is qualified. It's going to happen in the proper place. The patient's going to be selected properly. Yada yada yada. So approval is fairly straightforward. You know, for that sort of thing. But this is a bit of a weird situation where you've got a drug psychological combination. So I don't see how a HREC, without external guidance and expertise and really drilling into it, could ensure that you can approve it properly. As I said, all is very well until it goes bad, and then the finger is pointed at you and say, well, why did you approve that under the authorised prescriber scheme?
Just a final question from me before we get on to Dr. Robertson regarding indemnity for HREC in making these robust decisions.
Yeah. I mean, HRECs are indemnified, but that doesn't stop the opprobrium and, if you like, all the finger pointing and blowback that could come to an institution if you have granted authorised prescriber and then it goes bad. So I think there could be a bit of blowback. So again, there's a bit of institutional backside covering there, just in case. I think you need to be very careful.
So a good opportunity for shared learning as this takes off generally. Yeah. Fantastic. Thanks, Ian. I'm sure there'll be other questions in the chat that you might want to answer. So